something strange began happening to European fans after they arrived in America. At first, it was just a few surprised looks. Then came the photos, the videos, and the same question repeated again and again. Why don't we have this back home? These weren't famous landmarks or billion-dollar attractions. In fact, most Americans walked past them every day without giving them a second thought. But to visitors from across the Atlantic, some of the most ordinary parts of American life were anything but ordinary. Things they had once dismissed as excessive suddenly started making sense. Things they expected to be inconvenient turned out to be surprisingly effortless. And in places where they expected America to feel behind Europe, they found themselves staring at something they hadn't expected at all. By the end of their trip, the conversation had completely changed. Some were no longer asking why Americans needed these things. They were asking why Europe still didn't have them. And across 6 very different experiences, European fans began noticing the same uncomfortable pattern, one that made certain parts of life back home suddenly feel far more outdated than they remembered. So what exactly did they discover in America that changed their minds so quickly? And why did one of the most ordinary things Americans experience every single day leave some European visitors wondering how they had ever lived without it? The first answer revealed itself the moment they stepped out into the American summer. The first difference European fans began noticing was something most Americans barely think about, yet it followed them almost everywhere they went. Before coming to the United States, many Europeans had heard the familiar jokes about Americans and air conditioning. Buildings were supposedly kept unnecessarily cold. People relied too heavily on machines instead of simply opening a window, and an entire country seemed determined to turn every indoor space into the middle of winter. From a European perspective, where air conditioning is still far less common in many homes and older buildings, the American approach could easily look excessive. That perception began to change remarkably quickly once they experienced an American summer for themselves. In many parts of Europe, people are accustomed to dealing with hot days by opening windows, closing shutters, using portable fans, or simply accepting that indoor temperatures will rise with the weather outside. But in much of the United States, particularly in hotter and more humid regions, European visitors discovered an entirely different expectation. The moment you enter a hotel, restaurant, supermarket, airport, stadium, or even a small convenience store, the heat is simply left at the door. For football fans spending entire days moving through unfamiliar American cities, that difference became impossible to ignore. After walking outside under the summer sun, they could enter a stadium and immediately feel the temperature change. After crossing a huge parking lot, they could step into a store and find the same controlled comfort waiting for them. What surprised many of them was not simply that America had more air conditioning than Europe, but how completely it had been integrated into everyday infrastructure. In much of Europe, a cool indoor space during a heat wave can still feel like something you are fortunate to find, whereas in America, visitors quickly began expecting it everywhere they went. And that was where the comparison became uncomfortable. Europe is filled with magnificent historic buildings, beautiful old neighborhoods, and cities that Americans travel thousands of miles to experience. But preserving an older built environment can also mean that modern cooling systems are less widespread or harder to retrofit. Some European fans who had once viewed America's constant air conditioning as wasteful began seeing it differently after several days of moving between the heat outside and reliably comfortable spaces indoors. What had looked like an American obsession from across the Atlantic suddenly felt less like excess and more like a basic standard of daily comfort. Perhaps the biggest surprise came when they realized how quickly they had adapted to it. After only a short time in America, walking into a cool building no longer felt remarkable. It became something they simply expected to happen. And once a convenience becomes an expectation, returning to a bedroom that stays hot through the night, or a crowded building with little relief from the summer heat, can suddenly feel very different from how it felt before the trip. That is what made America's approach to air conditioning so revealing. The technology itself was nothing new to Europeans, and the United States certainly did not have a monopoly on comfortable buildings. The real culture shock came from the scale and consistency of it. Americans had taken something that remained optional or unevenly available in parts of Europe and quietly turned it into an invisible part of everyday life. So ordinary that Americans barely noticed it, yet noticeable enough that some European visitors would never look at a hot summer back home quite the same way again. But keeping people comfortable indoors was only the beginning, because the next difference appeared in a place European fans thought they already understood perfectly well. They walked inside expecting to do something completely ordinary, only to discover that in America, even that familiar experience had been built on an entirely different scale. The next surprise came in a place European fans thought would be completely familiar: the supermarket. After all, Europe has enormous shopping centers, international retail chains, and some of the most sophisticated commercial districts in the world. So few visitors arrived in America expecting an ordinary shopping trip to become another culture shock. Yet the moment they walked into some of the country's largest stores, the comparison they had in mind began to fall apart. In many European cities, shopping is still shaped by the environment around it. Smaller urban spaces, historic neighborhoods, and a greater dependence on walking or public transportation often mean that different needs are spread across different places. You might buy groceries in one store, visit another for household goods, travel somewhere else for electronics, and make a separate appointment when you need a particular service. For millions of Europeans, there is nothing unusual about that arrangement because their cities were built long before anyone imagined that all of those things should exist under one enormous roof. America developed in a very different direction, and European fans quickly discovered what that difference looks like at full scale. Some stores seemed less like supermarkets and more like self-contained commercial worlds, where a visitor could arrive needing food and leave hours later with clothes, electronics, household supplies, and products they had never intended to buy in the first place. What surprised them was not simply the size of the buildings, but the idea behind them. Instead of asking customers to move around the city to find what they needed, America had built places designed to bring almost everything to the customer. Then came the warehouse stores, and the sense of scale became even harder to ignore. European visitors, accustomed to buying enough groceries for the next few days, suddenly found themselves walking past packages designed to last for weeks, refrigerators filled with quantities that looked almost commercial, and shopping carts large enough to make an ordinary European basket feel miniature by comparison. Even familiar products somehow looked different when everything around them had been enlarged, stacked higher, and sold in quantities that made some visitors stop simply to take pictures. Of course, bigger does not automatically mean better. Europe's smaller stores can be easier to reach without a car, neighborhood shopping supports more frequent purchases, and many Europeans would reasonably question why anyone needs to buy such enormous quantities at once. But that was precisely what made the American experience so interesting. European fans were not necessarily abandoning the way they lived back home. They were discovering that the American system had optimized daily life around an entirely different priority: reducing the number of places you needed to go and making each trip accomplish as much as possible. For fans traveling across the country, that convenience became especially noticeable. In an unfamiliar city, there was something remarkably simple about entering one location and knowing that almost anything they had forgotten, broken, or suddenly needed could probably be found somewhere inside. What initially looked like excessive American consumerism began revealing another side of itself: an infrastructure of convenience built for people who value time, choice, and the ability to solve several problems in a single stop. And perhaps that was the real reason these stores left such an impression. Europe had taught many of its visitors that convenience meant having useful places within walking distance, while America showed them another definition entirely: making one destination so comprehensive that there was almost no reason to go anywhere else. Yet the next difference had nothing to do with buying more, owning more, or walking through a building the size of a small European neighborhood. It involved something far more basic, something every traveler eventually needs, and something many European fans had spent their entire lives assuming would always come with a small inconvenience. The third difference was far less impressive to look at, yet for some European fans, it became one of the most unexpectedly satisfying conveniences of the entire trip. There were no giant buildings to photograph and no enormous shopping carts to push around. It was simply the realization that when nature called, they could usually walk into a public place, find a restroom, use it, and leave without reaching for their wallets. For Americans, that sentence probably sounds almost ridiculous. Why would anyone consider using a restroom without paying to be a noteworthy experience? But across parts of Europe, particularly around busy train stations, tourist areas, and city centers, encountering a small entrance fee is hardly unusual. The amount itself may be insignificant, yet the experience can become surprisingly frustrating when a traveler urgently needs a restroom, but first has to find the correct coins, locate a payment gate, or search for another option nearby. That was why some European visitors found the American system strangely liberating. During long days, traveling between stadiums, fan zones, shopping centers, restaurants, and highways, restrooms seemed to appear wherever daily life naturally took them. Gas stations, large stores, highway stops, airports, and countless other businesses often provided access without turning a basic human need into a separate transaction. It was one of those conveniences that felt almost invisible until visitors began comparing it with the routines they had accepted back home. The contrast became even more noticeable on American road trips. In Europe, motorway service areas certainly exist, and many offer excellent facilities, but the experience varies considerably by country and location, and paid restroom access remains familiar in some places. In the United States, European fans traveling hundreds of miles could pull into a highway rest area or large travel stop and find facilities designed specifically for people constantly moving across enormous distances. The restroom was not treated as an optional extra. It was simply another expected part of the journey. What surprised visitors was that free did not always mean neglected. Many arrived with fairly modest expectations, particularly at roadside locations, only to encounter facilities that were cleaner and better maintained than they had anticipated. That did not mean every American public restroom was spotless, of course, but the combination of availability and free access was enough to make something completely ordinary to Americans feel unusually convenient to visitors who were accustomed to occasionally planning around it. Still, this was one area where Europeans quickly found something America had not perfected. The large gaps around some American restroom stall doors became an immediate source of confusion. To visitors accustomed to more enclosed stalls, the American design could feel unnecessarily exposed. And suddenly, the country that had made restroom access remarkably simple had created an entirely different question. Why make the restroom free and convenient, only to leave visitors wondering whether they had enough privacy once they stepped inside? That contradiction made the comparison more interesting. Europe often offered greater privacy once you were inside, while America frequently made the facility itself easier to access in the first place. Neither system was perfect, but after experiencing both, some European fans found themselves facing a choice they had never expected to think about. Would they rather pay occasionally for greater privacy, or accept America's unusual doors in exchange for knowing that when they needed a restroom, finding and using one would rarely become an adventure? It was a surprisingly small difference, but that was exactly the point. The conveniences that changed visitors' impressions of America were not always spectacular pieces of technology or massive infrastructure projects. Sometimes they were ordinary systems Americans had stopped noticing because they simply expected them to be there. And as European fans continued moving from city to city, the next difference became impossible to miss. This time, it was not hidden behind a restroom door or inside a giant store. It stretched for miles in front of them, and it revealed just how differently America had been built from the ground up. The fourth difference was impossible to miss because European fans encountered it almost every time they left their hotels. America simply seemed to have more space. Roads stretched wider, parking lots appeared enormous, and highways continued toward the horizon in a way that made even experienced European travelers reconsider their sense of distance. The contrast was especially striking for visitors from older European cities, where many streets were designed centuries before cars existed. In places like London, Rome, or Paris, narrow roads and limited parking are simply part of the urban experience. America, by comparison, often seemed to have been built with the assumption that people, vehicles, and cities would eventually need more room. That difference became even clearer when European fans started traveling between host cities. A journey that looked short on a map could consume hours, while crossing a single state sometimes felt like crossing several countries back home. Yet the infrastructure surrounding those distances was designed for exactly that kind of movement, with multi-lane highways, enormous interchanges, large parking areas, and roadside facilities appearing along routes built to carry people across an entire continent. Even the vehicles suddenly made more sense. Pickup trucks and large SUVs that could look excessive through European eyes seemed far less unusual when surrounded by roads and parking spaces designed to accommodate them. The comparison revealed something important. America had not simply built bigger cars and then struggled to find space for them. Much of the country had developed an entire physical environment where bigger vehicles could exist comfortably. That scale was not necessarily better for every kind of life. European cities often offered something many American communities struggled to match: the ability to walk outside, reach shops and restaurants within minutes, and live without depending heavily on a car. But for European fans experiencing America's vast distances firsthand, the sheer capacity of its infrastructure was difficult not to admire. What looked oversized from Europe suddenly looked strangely appropriate once they were standing inside it. America had been built around distances that many Europeans had never needed to think about, and once they experienced that scale themselves, some of its most famously excessive features began making a lot more sense. But the next surprise was waiting somewhere much more personal. After spending their days exploring America's enormous spaces, European fans returned each evening to discover that the difference in scale did not end when they walked through the front door. The fifth difference became apparent when European fans stepped inside American homes and realized that the country's obsession with scale did not stop at the driveway. For visitors accustomed to apartments and houses shaped by Europe's older, denser cities, even an ordinary suburban American home could feel surprisingly spacious. The obvious difference was size, but what left a stronger impression was how that space was used. Large kitchens, full-sized appliances, walk-in closets, laundry rooms, multiple bathrooms, and garages were not necessarily signs of extraordinary wealth. In many American communities, they were simply features of everyday middle-class life. Things that could feel like valuable luxuries in a compact European apartment were often treated as standard expectations in an American house. The contrast was partly a result of history and geography. Many European cities developed when space inside city walls was limited and daily life happened within walking distance, creating compact neighborhoods that remain highly desirable today. Much of suburban America developed under completely different conditions, with more available land and a culture built around families having their own private space. Neither model came without trade-offs, but experiencing both made the difference impossible to ignore. European fans also began noticing the conveniences hidden inside those homes. Central heating and cooling maintained a consistent temperature throughout the house. Large refrigerators reduced the need for frequent grocery trips, and garages provided space not only for cars but also for storage, hobbies, and everything that would otherwise compete for room inside the home. America had not simply made houses larger, it had used that extra space to remove small inconveniences from everyday life. That was when the comparison became more complicated. A historic apartment in Paris, Rome, or London could offer character, walkability, and immediate access to a city in ways that an American suburb could never reproduce. But after experiencing the privacy, storage, and effortless comfort of a spacious American home, some visitors began wondering how difficult it would be to return to paying a premium for considerably less space back home. Perhaps that was the real culture shock. European fans had expected American homes to be bigger because everyone already knew that. What they had not necessarily expected was how quickly all that extra room would begin to feel useful rather than excessive. And by this point, a pattern was becoming difficult to ignore. The air conditioning, the enormous stores, the accessible facilities, the roads, and now the homes all seemed to reflect the same American instinct. But there was still one final difference that connected all of them together. And once European fans noticed it, they began to understand why everyday life in America had felt so unexpectedly easy.